By the summer of 1944, Japanese naval aviation found itself trapped in a technological shadow it could no longer ignore. For years, Japan had relied on the skill and intuition of its pilots, trusting sharp eyesight more than electronic instruments. But now, over the vast Pacific, a new and invisible enemy dominated the skies: American radar. At first, Japanese commanders dismissed radar as an auxiliary tool, something Western nations exaggerated. They believed that experienced pilots could detect incoming aircraft long before machines could. But after the disastrous losses at the Philippine Sea, what American pilots later called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, the truth became painfully clear. Hellcats were intercepting Japanese formations long before they were even visible on the horizon. Something was guiding them with almost unnatural precision. Japanese engineers scrambled to understand how the Americans were doing it. Reports began arriving from scattered island garrisons. Enemy fighters appeared out of clouds at perfect angles, arriving exactly where they needed to be. Surviving pilots described the same pattern again and again. "They knew where we were," one pilot wrote. "Before we even climbed to altitude, they were already diving on us." Inside Tokyo's Imperial Navy Air Command, frustration grew. Their own radar systems were primitive, unreliable, and limited in range. Many early warning units had been destroyed during island bombardments. What few remained were outdated and easily confused by weather or terrain. Japan had the courage and training, but not the technology to match the Americans. Meanwhile, aboard American carriers, a revolution was underway. A single radar operator, sitting in a dim room lit only by green glowing screens, could track dozens of aircraft at once. He didn't need to see the enemy with his own eyes. The radar did that for him, detecting Japanese planes while they were still miles away. With calm precision, he guided up to 50 Hellcats into position, turning the skies into a coordinated hunting ground. For the Japanese, this was terrifying. Their scouts would search the sea for hours, unaware that their positions had already been plotted by a man they could not see, using technology they barely understood. They were flying blind into battles that had been decided before they even took off. By late 1944, Japanese strategists finally realized the nightmare. The Americans weren't winning because of luck or numbers alone. They were winning because radar had given them a new kind of vision, one Japan didn't have. A vision that stretched across the ocean, across clouds, across the night itself. And as that awareness sank in, a sobering truth emerged. Without radar, Japan wasn't just behind. It was defenseless. In the darkened operations room deep inside the carrier's steel hull, one man sat with a headset pressed tight against his ears. His world was a glowing green radar screen, its sweeping line painting the sky in silent arcs. He wasn't a pilot, nor a commander, but on this night, he held more power over the battle than any man in the air. With a calm voice and a steady hand, he would guide 50 F6F Hellcats through a fight the Japanese didn't even know had begun. The operator's name wasn't important to history. Dozens of men like him served on American carriers in 1944. But their role, what the Navy called fighter direction, was revolutionary. Radar had given them a kind of supernatural vision. They could see through clouds, across the sea, and even into the dark where human eyes failed completely. While Japanese pilots still relied on intuition and moonlight, the Americans had technology that turned night into a battlefield they controlled. On the radar screen, faint blips appeared, Japanese aircraft approaching from the west, still 60 miles out. The operator noted their speed, altitude, and formation. He didn't panic. He didn't even raise his voice. Instead, he pressed the switch on his console. Hellcat Group 1, come right heading 210. Increase altitude. Enemy contacts inbound at Angels 16. The fighters obeyed instantly. In the night sky, unseen by the Japanese, the formation shifted like a single living organism. Every move was calculated to put them in the perfect kill position before the enemy even knew they were there. Minutes later, the second group of blips appeared, more Japanese aircraft. The operator coordinated another squadron, turning his radar room into a battlefield command center where he alone saw the full picture. Pilots trusted him completely. They had to. Out here, blind without radar, their survival depended on the man watching the green screen. As the two forces closed in, the operator watched the distance shrink. 40 miles. 30. 20. The Japanese were flying straight into an ambush only one man could see. Clouds rolled over the ocean, hiding the Hellcats from view. But the operator could still track every plane. He adjusted headings, tightened formations, and cleared lines of attack with quiet authority. Then the final moment came. He gave the order. All groups, engage. What happened next became one of the most lopsided clashes in naval aviation. Hellcats burst through the clouds, diving with precision the Japanese could not understand. Their attackers seemed to materialize from nowhere, as if summoned by the night itself. The Japanese pilots fought bravely, but they were already defeated. For every maneuver they tried, American fighters were one step ahead, warned and positioned by the unseen voice in their radios. Back in the control room, the operator continued to track the fight, directing reinforcements and calling out enemy stragglers. He never left his seat. He never saw the dogfights with his own eyes. But his radar told the story, and his calm directions shaped the outcome. When the last Japanese blip faded from the screen, the operator finally leaned back. The carrier deck above him was crowded with returning Hellcats, almost all of them. It wasn't luck. It wasn't chance. It was coordination, technology, and discipline. One man, 50 fighters, and a radar system that changed the very nature of war. They thought the night would hide them. It had worked before. Darkness, cloud cover, silence. Japanese pilots had long relied on these elements to slip past enemy patrols and strike at American carriers lurking in the Pacific. But on this night, somewhere between the black sky and the blacker ocean, they would discover that the darkness now belonged to someone else. The formation of Japanese fighters moved eastward in a disciplined line, their engines humming steadily, their lights extinguished. The flight leader, Lieutenant Nakamura, kept his eyes forward, scanning for the faintest sign of the enemy fleet. He trusted his instincts more than any instrument on his worn-down control panel. For years, those instincts had been enough. But tonight he sensed something wrong. A pressure in the air. A quiet that felt too quiet. What Nakamura did not know, what none of the pilots knew, was that they had been detected almost 70 miles earlier. A single radar operator aboard an American carrier had watched their formation appear on his glowing screen like distant ghosts drifting into a trap he had laid with mathematical precision. While the Japanese searched desperately for silhouettes or engine noise, the Americans already had their altitude, bearing, and speed. The Hellcats were climbing, positioning themselves for the kill, guided by calm radio commands from a man the Japanese would never see. 20 minutes into their flight, Nakamura noticed subtle breaks in the clouds, movement, maybe shadows. He tapped his wingman's canopy and pointed, but the younger pilot saw nothing. The night played tricks on tired eyes. Still, a cold shiver ran across Nakamura's spine. He tightened his formation. Something was out there. Then it came. At first it was only a faint growl high above them. Not the engine note of a Japanese aircraft. This was deeper, heavier, unmistakably American. Nakamura's head snapped upward. Shapes emerged from the darkness. Not one, not two, but dozens. Hellcats diving in perfect unison, like steel hawks descending on prey. "Break! Break!" Nakamura shouted into his radio, but the airwaves were a mess of static. The formation split apart, but too late. Tracer fire exploded through the clouds, illuminating the night with violent streaks of orange. A Japanese bomber ignited instantly, spiraling downward in a burning arc. Another fighter shattered under cannon fire before its pilot even understood what was happening. The Hellcats seemed to come from every angle at once. They dove, fired, and vanished back into the night. It was coordinated, timed, impossibly precise. Japanese pilots climbed, dove, twisted, anything to break free. But each movement only tightened the jaws of the trap. Inside the American carrier, the radar operator continued issuing calmly spoken directions. Group 3 enemy breaking south. Adjust heading. You have advantage. The Japanese never heard the voice that controlled their fate. Nakamura managed to evade the first attack, rolling hard right and diving through a thin layer of cloud. His instruments rattled. His wings shook. He gasped for breath. But no sooner had he leveled out than a Hellcat appeared directly behind him, as if reading his next move before he made it. Nakamura swung his aircraft into a desperate climb, but the American stayed glued to his tail. A burst of machine gun fire tore through his fuselage. The cockpit filled with smoke. Controls stiffened. He fought to keep the plane airborne, but his strength was fading. As he spiraled downward, Nakamura saw the truth with devastating clarity. They had never been hunting the Americans. They had been the ones hunted from the start. The radar trap had closed, silent, invisible, perfect. The moment the first Japanese formation broke apart, the tone of the entire battle changed. What began as a cautious night flight for the Japanese instantly transformed into a deadly contest of control versus chaos. And from the first seconds, control belonged entirely to the Americans. High above the Pacific, the F6F Hellcats executed their attack with an orderliness that felt almost unnatural, certainly unlike anything the Japanese had ever faced. While Japanese pilots twisted and scattered, trying to find angles or break free into open sky, the Hellcats moved with a rhythm that seemed rehearsed, almost mechanical. Each squadron shifted into position as if following an invisible script. That script was being written in real time by the radar operator deep inside the carrier. He watched the glowing blips scatter across his screen, marking every turn, every altitude change, every desperate escape attempt. And with a steady tone, he guided the pilots with calm, clipped commands. Hellcat Group 1, enemy turning northwest. Cut the angle. Close the gap. Group 2, break left. You have 2 bogies diving at Angels 8. Group 4, hold altitude. Wait for my signal. Each order synchronized the attack. Up in the sky, the Hellcats moved like gears in a vast machine. One pivoting to cut off an escape path, another diving to attack, another climbing to cover the group from above. The Japanese pilots, meanwhile, faced a nightmare of disorientation. Their radios were unreliable, cloud banks kept swallowing formations, and they had no warning system to guide them. They flew blind, relying only on instinct. But instinct meant nothing when the enemy saw every move seconds before it happened. A young Japanese pilot named Ishida banked hard to the right, trying to rejoin 2 friendly aircraft he glimpsed through a break in the clouds. But before he could climb, a Hellcat dropped in behind him, perfectly aligned. A burst of gunfire tore across Ishida's wing. He tried to dive, but the American pilot anticipated it, rolling with him in perfect timing. Ishida barely had time to register the hit before his engine burst into flame. Elsewhere, a small group of Japanese fighters attempted to regroup. They formed a loose triangle and began climbing together, hoping to gain altitude and visibility. But the radar operator had already marked them. Group 3, 3 contacts climbing. Angle check, attack from above. 2 Hellcats dove from high altitude, their engines screaming as they fired into the clustered formation. The Japanese triangle shattered instantly, one fighter exploding, another falling into a spin, the third fleeing into the clouds. But even the clouds offered no safety. The Hellcats used radar vectoring to predict where each aircraft would exit. They waited at the edge of cloud banks like hunters waiting behind a door. A Japanese pilot punched through the mist, straight into a wall of tracer fire. His plane was torn apart before he could react. Minute by minute, the battlefield shrank. The Japanese fighters found themselves trapped in smaller and smaller pockets of sky, unable to climb, unable to regroup, unable to escape the constant pressure of coordinated American strikes. The most terrifying part wasn't just the skill of the Hellcat pilots. It was the timing. Each attack happened exactly when the Japanese least expected it. As soon as one fighter banked left to evade, another Hellcat appeared from that very direction. When a bomber climbed to escape a diving attack, a second American fighter was already above him. Felt less like combat and more like inevitability. As the last clusters of Japanese aircraft attempted to retreat, the Hellcats tightened their net one final time. A few pilots escaped into the darkness, heading west with engines damaged and fuel low, but most never made it out. Back on the carrier, the radar operator watched the final blips fade. He removed his headset, exhausted but steady. The battle had turned the moment the Hellcats launched, and under his guidance, they had struck with perfect, mechanical precision. The trap had worked, and now the Pacific sky belonged to the Americans. Dawn came slowly over the Pacific, washing the sky in pale gray after a night filled with fire and shadows. The ocean looked calm again, almost innocent, its surface giving no hint of the chaos that had unfolded only hours earlier. But inside the scattered Japanese airfields and command centers, there was no peace. The reports arriving that morning told a story far more devastating than any commander expected. Out of the formations launched the previous night, only a handful of aircraft returned. Many limped back with holes punched through their wings, controls barely responsive, fuel tanks nearly dry. Some pilots climbed out of their cockpits in silence, too shaken to speak. Others simply collapsed onto the tarmac, overwhelmed by exhaustion and disbelief. The senior officers who gathered around the returning airmen were desperate for answers. Where were you attacked? How many American fighters did you see? Were their carriers close? But the pilots couldn't give clear explanations. Their answers were fragmented, contradictory, confused. We never saw them coming. They dived out of the dark. They knew where we were. They were waiting for us, every time. One pilot, his voice trembling, said, "It wasn't luck. They were guided. They always arrived from exactly the right angle." As the testimonies piled up, a heavy realization spread through the command staff. This wasn't just another failed mission. This was a new kind of defeat, one shaped by technology Japan did not possess. Later that morning, intelligence officers reviewed intercepted American transmissions and reports from island garrisons. They found the same chilling pattern. American fighters were being directed with a level of precision impossible without advanced radar. At Imperial Navy headquarters, the mood turned grim. A colonel studying a map muttered, "We are being seen before we even take off." Another officer added quietly, "We are not fighting the pilots. We are fighting the machines." For years, Japan had believed skill and courage could compensate for the enemy's industrial advantage. But radar wasn't just another tool, it was a force multiplier that changed the rules of air combat. It allowed the Americans to intercept at long range, coordinate massive fighter groups, and strike with perfect timing. No amount of bravery could counter an enemy who knew your position long before you saw his silhouette. By midday, the Japanese High Command had drafted an emergency analysis. The conclusion was brutal. Without equivalent radar, future air operations will be unsustainable. In other words, the war in the sky was already lost. Meanwhile, aboard the American carrier, the mood was different. Pilots joked on deck, ground crews refueled and rearmed the Hellcats, and commanders reviewed the radar logs with quiet satisfaction. The radar operator, weary but calm, handed over his reports. To him, it had been another night's work, just reading the screen, giving directions, following procedure. But to the Japanese who survived, he might as well have been a ghost controlling the air itself. Back in Japan, engineers scrambled to improve their radar systems, but they were years behind. Factories lacked materials. Power grids were unreliable. And the skies were now dominated by American fighters that always seemed to arrive exactly where they needed to be. That evening, as officers wrote the final loss numbers in their reports, one commander paused his pen and whispered a truth no one wanted to say aloud. "This is the day we learned the war will be decided by electronics, not by pilots." Japan had entered the night believing skill could overcome technology. By morning, they understood the future belonged to those who could see the invisible.